Hello, everyone, and welcome to my final assignment, the presentation on a Shakespeare play. My name is Mark Tatum. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope you enjoy what you hear. I begin by saying it is not a stretch to say that William Shakespeare has ties to Christianity, and that his plays certainly have Christian underpinnings. His life has been well documented in being connected to the church in his upbringing through the Anglican faith. So, whereas the connection to Christianity is not difficult to make, what is more mysterious is whether Shakespeare intentionally peppered his work with several dozen Christian allusions, or whether that is simply a byproduct of his formation and worldview. Was Shakespeare being tongue in cheek about his faith, or is he simply being true to his core beliefs and using the allegories of his childhood? As a great playwright as he was, even with the best of exegetical tools and historical documents, we cannot fathom the mindset of William Shakespeare as he created, nor tap into his inspiration of the time. All we have are the relics of his work and the best historical research available. To be sure, Shakespeare's Christian allusions are well documented and can be traced throughout his body of work. So well documented, in fact, that one would think that it is eisegesis, the practice of reading into the text one's own biases and preferences. But indeed, it is not. Shakespeare's Christian allusions, although not necessarily blatant, are readily accessible, particularly for any who are proximate to the faith. Whether it is the sibling rivalry that is found in the play King Lear, or the tricky betrothal in Much Ado About Nothing, those who are familiar with the stories of the Bible will easily find parallels in Shakespeare's stories. But instead of zooming in on one particular parallel, for today's presentation, I want to zoom out and look at the Christian concept of the depravity of sin within the story of King Lear through the lens of Rene Girard's Mimetic theory. With this short journey, we'll see how theorist and author Rene Girard constructed the Mimetic theory, understand the depravity of original sin in Christendom, and see how Shakespeare writes a timeless piece of art imitating life. So buckle up, here we go. Author Rene Girard developed the Mimetic theory, which says that people desire and want only what they see other people desire and want. In the sense of the word, they mime or imitate others in their quest to fulfill their own desires. Innocent as this may begin, it unfortunately does not end there. The desire that one has, originating from another, can quickly turn into rivalry between the twain. Since one is not sure of their own quote-unquote original desires, they very insecurely begin to project negative emotions into their immediate surroundings and people. It comes out as direct rivalry, as in the case of two out of the three sisters in the play King Lear, or a crippling insecurity towards their peer, as in the case of Horatio and Don Pedro in the play Much Ado About Nothing. The mimetic desire worsens from here, as it has often turned into scapegoating, the practice of excommunicating outgroup members for the sake of mutual agreements between two original mimetic partners. Excommunication, although a social death, has often, in Shakespeare's plays, ended up in actual death. Although mimetic desire begins with a seemingly innocent or fleeting wish or desire, full grown, it can end up in death. This leads us nicely to the Christian concept of original sin. Christians believe that since the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis, mankind has been perpetually beleaguered with original sin, which is the proclivity to instinctively break God's laws as a first nature. Troubling as that is, there is still the notion of implicit and complicit sin. Original sin has mankind nailed down as implicit or inherited sin. But also there is complicit sin, that which we willingly or consciously partake and participate in. The Christian understands that participation in sin, whether voluntary or involuntary, is certain trouble for the believer. The book of Romans, chapter 3, verse 23 states that the wages of sin equal death. Even so, the thought process surrounding sin appears to be taken lightly and minor, even amongst Christians. But the poison of original sin is that it brings certain death. In the New Testament book of James, chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed." Verse 15 goes on to say, "Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." That sin, when it is full grown, brings about death, which is a direct correlation to the mimetic theory. We can now safely connect original sin with mimetic desire. Nowhere is it noted that mimetic desire is a virtue. Indeed, whatever causes one person to long, desire, or imitate another, especially to one's own detriment, deserves a conversation among the attributes of original sin. It was said in Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, that immediately after Adam and Eve's fall from grace, one of the consequences of their fall, particularly for Eve, was that her desire will be for her husband, and he shall rule over you. End quote. This desire is not the eros or agape that we would expect, particularly from the Greek language. In Hebrew parlance, this intrinsic desire is to rule over the man, or essentially usurping his position in the family. This automatically puts the husband and wife at odds with each other, mimetically desiring each other. Unchecked, this desire can lead to destruction and moral, spiritual, and even physical death. This, I argue, is the depravity of original sin as a whole. Unchecked, it leads to destructive endings which ruin relationships, tarnishes family ties, and eventually leads to moral, spiritual, and even physical death. It is not a thing to be traipsed upon lightly, left unchecked, or even winked at. To the point of this presentation, I believe that Shakespeare understood this dynamic, the universality of mimetic desire, how it is reminiscent of original sin, and ultimately how destructive it is. This is not more apparent than in the tragedy King Lear. King Lear is, in a word, chock full of tragedies, from ruined family relationships to the eventual death of all complicit parties. It begins with the abdication of King Lear's throne to give to his daughters, especially to those who would give him the best devotion. Therein begins our mimetic desire journey, primarily between the elder two sisters. But then Gerard purports the theory of mimetic contagion, in that once mimetic desire is established and pronounced in an individual, or in the play state character, others are then liberated to explore their mimetic desire in the small community circle they commingle in. In other words, mimetic desire becomes contagious. We see the mimetic desire begin with the two older sisters, to then catch to the younger sister, and so on and so forth. The end of this classically tragic tale is that every main character dies without hope for redemption. This, I argue, is the same thing that happens when unchecked sin, could we say jealousy, is allowed. Certain death, the death of relationships, health, and even physical death. In closing, does Shakespeare have in mind the depravity of original sin as he penned this particular play? Let alone did Shakespeare have the pre-articulated theory of mimetic desire in his mind as his inspiration? It is hard to ascertain this, as we don't have the privilege of speaking directly with Shakespeare to curry that bit of information from him. To offer a decisive answer, I think not. It is my belief that Shakespeare, along with all other great artisans throughout the centuries, had a keen ability to channel timelessness into their artwork. If you were to ask any artist whose work is still celebrated for decades, if they're still living, or centuries, if they were dead, they can barely articulate the rationale of their craft. They just do. It is more of a feeling or an art form, rather than a scientific formula that helps them to derive their work. I safely believe that Shakespeare is in this same ilk. Although, yes, he grew up of Christian origin, it is certainly undergirded many of the social dynamics he portrayed. For him to be evangelical is a reach, for sure. Shakespeare was simply entertaining the world with the stuff in his brain and his worldview. Suffice it to say that genius can scarcely be explained, but certainly celebrated. Thank you for listening and engaging in this presentation. I hope it was informative.